This story was told to me by my good friend. She's a 24-year-old female. We'll call her Annette. This is her story. Annette came from an abusive home. Her father was an alcoholic who abused her and her mother, while her mother was suffering from depression due to her own mother's death. Annette was miserable and was looking for a way out. She considered herself asexual and never once had a sexual thought about anyone. This took place when she was only 22 years old. Anyways, one day, she decided to hang out at Taco Bell trying to pass the time since she had no friends of her own. While waiting for her order, she noticed a young man wearing a suicide silence shirt. She complimented his shirt, and next thing she knew, the young man was in her booth, and the two were talking about their favorite bands. He introduced himself as David. He himself was 23 years old, and told her about his experiences in the military as a private contractor in the Marines. This was a bit odd, since they had only been speaking for about half an hour, but she quickly forgot about it, as he moved on to talk about favorite movies, TV shows, etc. After eating, the two exchanged numbers and went their separate ways. After that, the two began to hang out almost every day, going to the mall, the movies, paintballing, and other fun activities like that. For the first time in years, Annette was happy and having fun, though this would change once she went home and her mother gave her a hard time for going out and having fun. Annette had always been sheltered and would do all she could to help her family, even if it meant she would stay indoors and have no friends. So when Annette finally began to have fun, her parents began to humiliate her and abuse her, both mentally and physically. It was almost a year since Annette had first met David, and the two had been hanging out frequently. This was when Annette's father chased her into her bedroom for having a male friend. Annette decided enough was enough. She grabbed her things, packed them in an old backpack, went through her bedroom window, and walked about 2 miles to David's home. She was welcomed with open arms by David and his then girlfriend, Lila. I wish I could say that this story was all about Annette's abuse, and she found 2 good friends who treated her right, but I would be lying. The first 2 months went wonderful. Annette helped out with rent, cleaned around the trailer, and even began jogging to get into better shape. After those first 2 months, David told Annette that Lila would be flying to her hometown in Florida for a family reunion and wouldn't be back for a few weeks. Annette was kind of taken aback by it, since Lila was very open and would show off almost every day about a new thing, so she thought it was weird that Lila never mentioned this. But Annette just ignored it and moved on. A few days passed, and David told Annette that the trailer was being taken by Lila's father, who was the owner of the trailer, because Lila wanted to find a better place. Again, Annette thought this was strange, but not wanting to go back to her abusive home, she didn't question David and decided to help him rent a room at Motel 6 for the two can stay, since David promised he had a nice apartment ready for them, but it would take a few days for it to be ready. Annette became a little concerned when days turned into weeks at the Motel 6. Nothing was brought up about the apartment, but she didn't want to seem like a needy little girl, so she just left it alone. Besides, she was just happy to forget about her past. And this is where things begin to get dark. David suffered from PTSD. He would have night terrors and would wake up breathing heavily, and Lila would calm him down before they went back to sleeping. This would occasionally happen while at the Motel 6, in which Annette felt she should help David calm down. This would work, and she'd just get back to bed and fall asleep. One night, Annette decided to stay up and finish reading Gone Girl, since she wanted to finish the book before watching the film. She was in the right bed, while David was in the left bed, right in front of the front door. Annette had her own lamp on, and was deep into the novel, when she began getting a weird feeling, as if someone was watching her. She slowly turned her head to the left, and jumped to see David sitting up, cigarette in hand, staring through it. Annette just stayed still, red flags going off, telling her she was in danger, though she didn't understand. She called to him, but got no response. After what felt like a century, David flicked a cigarette at Annette, before laying back down as if nothing happened. Annette caught the cigarette in her lap, which she threw to the floor when she felt the burn. As she got up to go throw it away, David gasped and began to shake, as if having a seizure, and gasped for air. Annette began to pet his head, as usual, but instead of David going back to sleep, he locked his eyes with Annette's before grabbing her by the hair, throwing her over his bed and climbing on top of her. Having no time to react, Annette squealed before David put his hands around her neck and began to strangle her. According to Annette, she could see her life go through her head as a million flashbacks at once. With all of her strength, she reached for a lamp and hit David upside his head. This gave Annette a chance to run, but David grabbed her hair and began to drag her across the room to the restroom. Annette screamed, which seemed to startle David, who loosened his grip on her hair. Annette kicked David and ran out the door. She ran for a while before arriving at her cousin's home. She never told her what happened and spent the night. The next day, David called to ask where she'd been, to which Annette told him the whole incident. David was confused and expressed he had no memory of that. He did apologize and asked her to come back so they could talk. They ended up working things out, and they went on as if nothing happened. Some more time passed, and Annette was able to make amends with her mother, who had left her father. The two began catching up, which seemed to anger David, to the point that he was bringing up memories of her abuse towards Annette. David grew angry by the day, and would begin abusing Annette, calling her weak and stupid for returning to her mother. Annette didn't want to leave David, since he had mentioned before that everyone he ever met ended up turning their back on him. Annette felt bad, and felt she couldn't be the same as other people. This was around the time my roommate and I moved into the Motel 6, due to our own difficulties, and we ended up meeting Annette. She seemed finished, and would try and avoid contact with others, due to David's jealousy, though she would speak to my roommate when she was alone, and eventually spoke to me as well. When David found out, he was more than pissed. He confronted Annette, who threatened to call the police. David ended up beating her. Annette was terrified. She felt that if she tried to leave, he would track her down and kill her. This went on for a while, until my own roommate and I moved out, a few weeks after. David had just left for work, so Annette decided to go buy some groceries. While doing so, she noticed an older woman, somewhere in her late 40s, staring at her, as if trying to read Annette. Annette finally got the courage to start up a conversation with the woman, who turned out to be very friendly. It turned out the woman, Kate, worked with David and had recognized Annette, since she always brought David food for lunch. Kate seemed nervous, but she looked Annette straight in the eye and said, "You need to look out for David." Annette was confused, but Kate took her outside and spilled everything. Annette was shocked and terrified. She thanked Kate, returned to the motel room, and packed up her belongings before calling her mother to pick her up. It turns out, David was bragging to everyone at work that Annette was his little puppet, and how he was convinced to get into her pants that weekend. Not only that, but he also bragged about killing people who wronged him, including his ex. Annette has no idea whether he meant Lila or anyone else, but this made her worry even more. Before her mother picked her up, I actually ran into her, and she gave me her number before taking off. She was in such a hurry, and I didn't even understand what was going on. David knocked at our door a few days after, asking for Annette, to which my roommate said he didn't know. I remember almost yelling out, Annette was at her mother's, but I felt he would have known if she wanted him to, so I just kept quiet. This last encounter happened August 2015. I had forgotten about the whole thing, until a few weeks ago I ran into Annette at a bar. She quickly recognized me and hugged me. She seemed much happier than the last time I had seen her, and we caught up. She ended up inviting me over to her place the next morning, which is when she told me everything. Today, Annette lives alone in a one-bedroom apartment, along with a 2-year-old Rottweiler she adopted. The last time she heard from David was while walking to her mother's house. He passed by in a truck and spotted her. He turned to follow, but Annette went through some yards and lost him. He had been calling her non-stop, before Annette changed her number, and her mother moved in with her aunt. Although everything worked out for Annette, who is now someone I consider to be a true friend, there is something that bothers me. When telling me about seeing David in the truck, she expressed how he had the same exact look he had the night he tried to strangle Annette, which made me wonder, was David faking night terrors? What if he actually tried to take advantage of Annette that night? I brought this up to Annette already, who never even thought about it before. Hopefully, David is far from here, because God only knows what I'd do to that asshole if I ever ran into him. So this story actually began 21 years ago, and has been going on for that long. My parents bought a bigger home for us when I was 5. It's a big 3-tenant home. The only people that lived there at the time were an elderly couple on the 2nd floor. I remember being a little afraid of the old woman because she couldn't speak and had a hole in the middle of her throat from years of smoking. Anyway, my older brother and I quickly got used to the house, as well as the basement. It was old, but we kept most of our toys and bikes there, along with my dollhouse. Every day after school, we would go down to the basement to play. I began to notice little trinkets on the floor of my dollhouse left for me from the old woman. I thought it was so nice she was bringing me gifts. This went on for a long time, and every day, I couldn't wait to get home to find my new trinkets. This one particular day, I got home, went down to see my dollhouse, and there wasn't the usual small trinkets there. In front of my dollhouse was a Ouija board. I had seen them on TV, but never one in real life. Of course, like any other 7-year-old at the time, my curiosity got the better of me, and I immediately started playing with it. I would even have my friends over to play with it together. I remember closing all the curtains and shutting the bedroom window to make the room dark as we played, asking the usual questions like, "Is anyone here?" And to our surprise, we would get an answer. They were mostly yes or no answers. A few days later, we stopped playing. Not sure why. I guess you could say we got bored. And that's when things started happening. I began seeing him. He wasn't old, but he really wasn't young either. He had a white button-down shirt and slacks and suspenders. I was the only one who could see him. My parents figured it was just an imaginary friend. I wasn't afraid of him, even though I knew he shouldn't be there. Things would move on its own. Footsteps in the living room or the stairs when no one else was there. And of course, I would get blamed for things going missing or stuff being moved, because I was considered the odd child. But I knew something was wrong. When I started high school, the man began to fade. It just became a shadow. One night, my brother got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, which was past my bedroom. He happened to look in and saw a figure standing over me. He thought it was Mom, so he didn't think much of it. I remember waking up startled because I felt the fingernails like scratch on my head. I quickly turned the lights on, but no one was there. As the years went by, the strangest things would happen more often. Not finding things where I left them, doors opening on their own, the footsteps, and also the shadows. Shadows would lurk outside of certain rooms, or pass by me, or just stand in corners of different rooms. I became terrified, and still no one would believe me. My sister-in-law moved upstairs from me when she and my brother got married. One night she was working late, and my brother worked the night shift. As she pulled into our driveway, she looked up at the window and saw what she thought was my brother watching her through the window, and then closed the curtain. She went up to their apartment and looked for him. When she couldn't find him, she called his cell, and he explained to her that he'd been at work all night and hadn't left. She didn't sleep that night. Another night, I was awoken from my sleep when I heard my cat frantically scratching at my bedroom door. When I opened my eyes, there was a dark figure of a man standing directly in front of my bed, reaching for me and moving his arms side to side. Panicking, I jumped for the light, and it was quickly gone. My cat refused to come into my room that week. Things escalated. Every day, I felt like I was being stalked in my own home. One day in late fall, we were renovating one of the old bathrooms,
When the contractors knocked the wall down, he stopped and asked, "When did your house burn down?" I was so confused and asked what he was talking about. I looked in the walls for myself and saw the inside of the walls of my home were mostly black and charred from previous fire. Stumped, I went and dug up the old archives for my home. My house was built in 1901. This I knew about. What I didn't know was that 30 years later, it burnt down in a horrific fire, destroying the 3rd floor and most of the 2nd floor, and surprisingly, killing a young man in the process. The same man I've been seeing for years. They ended up rebuilding the house with new parts and also any old parts they could save from the fire. After this crazy discovery, you may ask, so when did you guys move out? Well, we are still here. This is my home. This is also his home. I've learned to live in this house, knowing it doesn't only belong to me. A seance was performed in the home not to expel the spirit, but to bring calm and peace to the house.
This incident occurred on March 5th, very late. Technically, it was the wee morning hours of March 6th. I have battled insomnia for several years. I've been prescribed that notorious drug, Ambien, in the past. But after calling friends late at night, doing a little midnight cooking and sleepwalking, I told the doc, no more. I now settle for over-the-counter stuff and Chamomile. I'm adding this because I want you to understand that I was not under the influence of anything other than a little Chamomile tea, which doesn't do a darn thing for me. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I decided to finally go to bed and attempt to will myself to sleep. I should probably mention here that my bedroom is fairly large. I have a 6-foot bookcase that sits directly across from my bed. I always keep a nightlight burning in the master bath, which is adjoined to my room. The light dimly lights up part of my bedroom, the part with the bookcase. As I was fluffing my pillows for the 10th time, I noticed a small movement in my peripheral vision. I always sleep with a fan going, no matter how chilly it may be outside, so occasionally, the fan will blow on something, causing movement. This movement was not caused by my fan. It was coming from the top of the bookcase. The only thing that sits on top of the bookcase is a beautiful 3-dimensional display of the Lord's Supper. I purchased it on a shopping excursion to Mexico several years ago. I treasure it because it is so beautiful and so well made. I keep it on top of the bookcase to ensure it doesn't get broken. I sat up in bed, staring in the dim light at the top of the bookcase. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw what looked like a small porcelain doll of about 6 to 8 inches tall. Now, I do have a doll in my room. She is a gorgeous Victorian doll, about 18 inches tall. She is dressed in a lovely, very elaborately designed Victorian dress with a matching hat and a purse that she holds in her hand. She is a collector's item, given to me a couple of years ago. Although I'm not a collector of dolls, I adore this one and would never part with her. I call her my Victorian lady. Well, my Victorian lady sits on top of my dresser, on the right side of my room. The doll that was on top of my bookcase was not my Victorian lady. I had never seen this doll before. As my eyes completely adjusted to the dim light, I could see that the doll was slightly turned to the right, which was facing my bedroom door. I could make out that she was wearing a blue and white dress with a matching bonnet or hat. As I continued to stare in disbelief, the doll began to slowly move. As I continued to watch, stunned and completely horrified, I finally realized that the doll was doing some sort of bizarre dance. It moved in short, stilted-like movements that caused chills to go over my entire body. My hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The doll kept moving in that fashion, but began moving faster. The dance it was performing was somewhat seductive, as bizarre as that sounds. I can only describe it as doing something similar to a burlesque dance. It moved its shoulders in a seductive way. I thought to myself that I was glad it wasn't looking directly at me. Suddenly, as if reading my thoughts, the doll's head began to turn very slowly in my direction. Then as I continued to watch, now completely paralyzed with fear, the doll turned its head and body so that it was completely facing me. I literally could not move as I just continued to watch, silently praying in my head. In the dim light, I could barely make out that it was smiling, but it was an evil, twisted sort of smile, more demonic than something that should be painted on a doll's face. Finally, after what seemed to be an hour, I was able to reach over and turn on the bedside lamp. But to my increasing horror, the light didn't come on. I had just recently replaced a light bulb, so there's no logical reason as to why the lamp wouldn't turn on. I knew that it had to be the evil that was radiating from that doll that prevented the light from being shed. I slowly got up from the bed and took a couple of steps towards the doll. I nearly fainted from fear when I could clearly see that the doll had sharp, pointy teeth. Now, it actually appeared to be laughing at me. It began dancing faster and faster. I fled to my bathroom and shut the door behind me. I'm not sure how long I stayed in that bathroom, just praying and trembling in fear. I finally summoned up the nerve to come out of the bathroom. I had the full light shining from the bathroom, illuminating the bookcase. The doll was not there, just a 3D display of the Lord's Supper. Still trembling, I just stared up at the top of the bookcase, still not believing what I had just seen. I thought I saw a movement in the display. As I continued to stare, the figures inside the display were slowly moving. As I continued to watch, the figures, including the figure of Jesus in the middle, were slowly swaying back and forth. I could not believe what I was seeing. Horrified, I watched as the hands on the figures began to move, and it appeared as if they were talking to each other. I slowly backed away, never taking my eyes off the display. I sat on the end of my bed, once again trembling all over. Most of the figures are sitting around the table. They are approximately 1.5 inches tall. There are a few that are sitting at the sides of the table. They are about 3 inches tall. Right before my wide eyes, I watched as 3 of the disciples stepped out of the display and stood at the edge of the bookcase. They began growing in size until they were about 6 inches tall. In the display, they are all painted in clothing that is light blue and light green. The 3 figures that were standing on the top of the bookcase were wearing velvety looking robes with intricate designs and gold sashes. They were moving around, moving their hands and their heads. They appeared to be talking to each other. Very slowly, never taking my eyes off the figures, I shut off my fan. I listened, straining to hear what they were saying. I never heard a word, but visibly, they appeared to be in a conversation. I'm not sure how long I sat there on my bed, just watching these figures in a mixture of total fascination and utter horror. I didn't have the same fear of them as I did the doll. I'm not sure if it was because they represented Jesus' disciples, or because they didn't appear to even notice me. Probably a little of both. But I eventually left my room, and just sat in the living room in stunned silence. I didn't even attempt to try to sleep after that. I knew that it would be totally impossible. It was several hours before I even went back into my room. When I finally did, I changed my room around, moving the bookcase to the other side of the room so that it was no longer across from my bed. I carefully packed the Lord's Supper display and put it away. I contemplated throwing it out, but I just can't do that. Instead, it's put up so that I don't have to see it anymore. I haven't seen the diabolical doll anymore. Of course, I absolutely refuse to even glance over in the direction of the bookcase after I turn the lights out. I realize that this story is very far-fetched and extremely hard to believe, but I swear on my life, every detail is true.